The earliest known records discussing skin color come from ancient Mesopotamia, where healthy skin colors were described as having a reddish complexion, or samu. Lighter complexions were described as pesu, and were associated with illness, at least in regards to men. They would also describe people having jaundice as being pale brown to yellow, or arku. The Akkadian culture later used pesu to describe albinism, and the word samu, or black, would be used to describe people with dark skin as they began interacting more with the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt. Both brown and blue eyes were also referenced in Mesopotamian writings. The Egyptian Book of Gates was more specific, going into 4 groups. Egyptians described themselves as, quote, being red-brown. Levantine and Canaanite people were described as pale, Nubians were black, and Libyans were described as having, quote, fair skin. In art, Egyptians generally depicted themselves as considerably darker skinned than the people from what is now Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Libya, but as considerably lighter skinned than those from what is now modern Sudan. Egyptian women were painted as having a lighter skin complexion than men, who would be painted dark reddish brown, while women would be painted using white, tan, cream, or yellow. Most archaeologists ascribe this to the differing lifestyles of men and women at the time, as depictions of women with light skin suggested a high status, as the woman would not need to work outdoors, and so light skin came to be seen as a feminine ideal in Egyptian art. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote on skin color, quote, "Those whose skin is too dark are cowardly. Witness Egyptians and the Ethiopians. Those whose skin color is too light are equally cowardly. Witness women. The skin color typical of the courageous should be halfway between the two." The Greek physician Hippocrates believed many traits derived from climate. He wrote, quote, "The forms and dispositions of mankind correspond with the nature of the country." He argued people from temperate climates were, quote, "not apt for labor, while people of, quote, mountainous, rugged, elevated, and well-watered tended to be warlike people, of areas that were, quote, level, windy, and well-watered, were peaceful, even, quote, unmanly." Skin lightening rituals for women that could sometimes involve literal bleaching of the skin have been found in documents from ancient Greece and Rome. But these actions are not exclusive to the West, as similar documents have also been found in Korea around the same time frame. And similarly, negative views of others who looked different wasn't exclusive to the West, with at least one 3rd century Chinese historian describing blonde-haired and blue-eyed outsiders as resembling, quote, "the monkeys from which they are descended." Chinese were also known to describe those with darker complexions from Southeast Asia as black and tended to associate lighter skin with higher status as they had, quote, freedom from manual labor. But more often, traits were not ascribed to skin or climate, but to cultures. Roman Emperor Julian asked, quote, "Come tell me why it is the Celts and the Germans are fierce, while the Hellenes and Romans are, generally speaking, inclined to political life and humane, though at the same time unyielding and warlike. Why the Egyptians are more intelligent and more given to crafts, and the Syrians unwarlike and effeminate, but at the same time intelligent, hot-tempered, vain, and quick to learn. For if there is anyone who does not discern a reason for these differences among the nations, but rather declaims that this is also befell spontaneously, how, I ask, can he still believe that the universe is administered by a providence?" Slavery existed all over the world, including in the Roman Empire, but the enslavement terms appeared to have been based around ethnicity more than skin color, with both light and dark-skinned people enslaved. But that isn't to say no one made any claims to virtue in lighter skin color. In the West, the earliest reference appeared to come from early Christian scholars in the 300s. Gregory of Nyssa wrote, quote, "Christ came into the world to make blacks white, Babylonians into Jerusalemites, the prostitute into a virgin, Ethiopians radiantly white." But even in these descriptions, whiteness did not appear to be thought of as a specific race in and of itself, rather than a cultural group that people were biased against. For example, in the 400s, a bishop wrote of baptizing an Ethiopian baby that they had, quote, "not yet whitened by the grace of Christ." Byzantine scholars could write that invaders were both barbarians, but also have white bodies and fair hair. The Bible itself stated there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. As a rationalization for racist beliefs, some have pointed to the story of Noah and his son Ham for justification for racist ideas. This despite the story being only 8 lines in the book of Genesis and having no reference to race or skin color. It's likely this came as a result of the name Ham sounding similar to a word in Middle Eastern languages of the time that meant dark or brown. In the most common version of the story, Noah became drunk and was in his tent naked. Noah's son Ham saw his father naked and told either his older brothers or his uncles. These older men covered Noah up without looking at him, and when Noah woke up, he cursed Ham's son, Canaan, to be a servant to the older men. There is a general consensus by Bible scholars that the intent of the parable was to explain the politics of the day, specifically why the Canaanites were ruled over by the Israelites. But from those 8 lines, a good deal of rationalization seemed to emerge. In medieval Europe, the curse of Ham wasn't initially based on skin color or even ethnicity, but it was used to rationalize feudalism and the plight of the serf. Some argued that the dependents of Ham were actual Europeans, and those who worked hard would actually receive a greater reward in heaven as a result. There was one specific version, written by a Jewish Babylonian Aramaic text, the title translated to Chapters of Rabbi Eliezer, that focused on skin color-based interpretation by saying, quote, "He, Noah, especially blessed Shem and his sons, making them black but comely, and he gave them the habitable earth. He blessed Ham and his sons, making them black like the raven, and he gave them an inheritance of the coast of the sea. He blessed Japheth and his sons, making them entirely white, and he gave them for an inheritance in the desert and its fields." Those who followed this text claimed it was from the 1st century Judea, but modern scholarship puts it much later, likely in the mid-700s. But regardless of the actual age of the text, some of the topics appear to have influenced Islamic theology around the topic. This in spite of the Prophet Muhammad reportedly stating in his farewell sermon, quote, "O people, your Lord is one, and your Father is one. There is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab over an Arab. No superiority of a white person over a black person, nor superiority of a black person over a white person, except through the mindfulness of God." At the same time, neither the Quran nor the Bible specifically forbade slavery. Slavery wasn't exclusive to places where Abrahamic religions emerged, and was practiced all around the world in almost every place where food was plentiful enough to allow large settlements. In most instances, slavery was used as a consequence for the individual, be they prisoners of war, criminals, or simply someone who owed a debt. Orphans and abandoned children could also find themselves enslaved. Skin color didn't seem to protect anyone from becoming a slave. Many historians have written that figuring out who was and was not a slave in antiquity based on physical appearance was more or less impossible, as so many different ethnic groups were at risk for enslavement at the same time, particularly in the Egyptian and Roman empires. Generational slavery, that is the slavery where a child was born enslaved because their parent was a slave, existed, but it wasn't the most common form of slavery. After the fall of Rome and large parts of Central Europe, slavery declined to the point of all but disappearing by the 1200s. But this was not so much out of kindness as practicality. Feudal serfdom, convict labor, and indenture contracts tended to provide the sufficient labor supply without the added expense of purchasing, transporting, and caring for slaves. Feudal laws around land ownership made independent farming difficult, as land was understood to be owned by the various monarchs to be administered by the feudal lords. Labor on the land was ostensibly in exchange for protection from the outside invaders, but it was arguably in practice a protection racket. As the Roman trade routes by land collapsed, the rise of banditry made travel dangerous, meaning there wasn't much competition for labor outside of urban areas. If you were born a peasant of a feudal lord, you would almost certainly live and die as one, as would your children and their children, and so peasants were cheaper than slaves in much of Europe. Over time, the Catholic Church slowly began to codify these cultural and economic changes, and the Church implemented rules forbidding Catholics from enslaving Catholics, adding another incentive for church membership for the poor. But this was only true in Catholic areas. In the north, Viking raiders often engaged in slave raids of their coastal neighbors, generally to kidnap women who would then be forced either into sexual slavery or marriage. An Irish chronicle written near modern-day Dublin around 1821 wrote, "They carried off a great number of women into captivity." This practice was so prevalent that DNA evidence of modern Iceland indicates that about 2/3 of the women who were part of the founding population of the island coming by way of the Norse Vikings were actually of Gaelic origin. Based on the archaeological evidence, many Viking slaves were treated with violence. Slave graves show sign of physical abuse and decapitation, and it also appears in some cases slaves were buried with their owners, likely as human sacrifices. And of course, none of this had anything to do with skin color. A Tunisian philosopher wrote after traveling to northern Europe, quote, "The inhabitants of the north are not called by their color, because the people who established the conventional meanings of the words were themselves white. Thus whiteness was something usual and common to them, and they did not see anything sufficiently remarkable in it to cause them to use it as a specific term." Unlike the feudal parts of Europe, coastal and Mediterranean Europe remained heavily involved in the slave trade with North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia long after the fall of Rome. Venice, Genoa, and Malta were well known for having large slave trade markets. Although in the Catholic Italian city-states the enslavement of Catholics was banned, sale of non-Christians or even Orthodox Christians were quite legal. Islamic laws in many places similarly might forbid the sale of some Muslims, but usually only specific sects, meaning, for example, a Sunni Muslim might be able to enslave a Shia, or vice versa. Many Eastern Europeans practiced the Slavic religion, which meant enslaving them was not forbidden by either group. In fact, the word slave comes from the practice of enslaving the Slavic people of Eastern Europe and Central Asia who practiced this religion. Two major slave trade routes emerged connecting the Italian city-states to the slave trade from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, one by land and one by sea. The land route was largely through Prague and was known as the Balkan slave trade. Venetian slave traders would have caravans come to Prague, and from Prague be guided through the Alpine passes to reach markets in Venice. The sea route usually came to Genoa, often from Crimea, usually through the city of Kaffa, which had one of the largest slave markets in the world. For a significant amount of time, slavery was the largest source of income for the Canaanite of Crimea. Tatar slavers would raid what is now southern Russia, Lithuania, and Moldavia as part of what they described as harvesting of the steppe. A Ukrainian folk song describes the raids this way, quote, "The fires are burning behind the river. The Tatars are dividing their captives. Our village is burnt and our property plundered. Old mother is sabred and my deer is taken into captivity." Reports indicated that there were generally around 30,000 slaves in Kaffa at any given moment. A Lithuanian writer wrote of Kaffa that it was, quote, "not a town, but an abyss into which our blood is pouring." In 1346, the Mongols laid siege to the city. During the siege, it was reported that the bodies of Mongol warriors who had died of the plague were catapulted over the walls and into the city, and that the refugees who fled to Genoa may have been the ones who brought the Black Death to Europe. But regardless of who was in control or which side raided, all types of slaves were brought to central locations like Crimea to be sorted and distributed from there. Young girls were brought to be sold into sexual slavery, many going into the harems of various Ottoman rulers. Men could be sold into agricultural work or military service, and it was said the most unfortunate would be sold as galley slaves, as each Ottoman galley would require as many as 200 rowers. Those sold into military service were often given a kind of legal freedom after they had completed training, in exchange for them agreeing to serve the person who purchased them. These slave soldiers made up much of the military in places like Egypt and Syria. At one point in Egypt, a soldier class of freed slaves known as the Mamluk became powerful enough to stage a coup and take control of the government. But even after they took power, they kept the slavery practices largely unchanged. In the early 3rd century, domestication of the camel began to make trans-Saharan trade routes viable. And the trade along these routes grew exponentially in the 7th and 8th century with the expansion of Islam into West Africa, creating more stable trade networks based around shared language and religion. These trans-Saharan trade routes primarily bought salt to sub-Saharan Africa in exchange for gold, but they also facilitated a growing slave trade from sub-Saharan Africa. Groups like the Barbary pirates conducted slave raids on coastal towns all around Western Europe, going as far as Iceland on rare occasions to find victims. Up through the 12th century, these captives made up the majority of the slaves sold in North African slave markets. But as the trans-Saharan slave trade expanded generally, sub-Saharan African slaves became easier to acquire and eventually surpassed Western European slaves in those markets. In eastern sub-Saharan Africa, many slaves were captured from what is now Ethiopia. An Slavic cartographer wrote, quote, "The people of Lathem are perpetually being invaded by their neighbors, who take them as slaves and carry them off to their lands to sell them by the dozen to the merchants. Every year, great numbers of them are sent off to the western Maghreb." Further down the Swahili coast, he wrote the slavers would, quote, "steal the children of the Zans using dates, lure them with dates and lead them from place to place until they seize them, take them out of the country and transit them to their own countries." Because Spain and Portugal were under the control of the Islamic Caliphate for hundreds of years, their experience through all of this was very different than the rest of Europe. The Iberian Peninsula had long been subject to conquest by the Romans starting around 200 BC, who were followed by the German Visigoths in the 5th century. Next, it was conquered from the south by the Islamic Caliphate starting in the 700s. These invasions made the peninsula much more multi-ethnic, multi-religious region compared to the rest of Western Europe. Starting in 1095, the Catholic Church began calling for religious military crusades. Some were called in order to capture religious sites like Jerusalem, and some were called to reclaim other areas that were taken under Islamic control, like the Iberian Peninsula. By around 1250, all of Portugal and most of Spain was under at least some sort of Catholic rule, with the exception being the southern kingdom of Granada. In these newly conquered Catholic areas, there were laws that put Jewish and Muslims at risk and disadvantage, but it was nothing in comparison to the acts of other nearby Catholic states which had been engaged in heresy trials for centuries. In other parts of Europe, even practicing a variation of Christianity could have you being burned for heresy, so this was still a relatively high level of acceptance. Islamic communities were more or less unheard of, and massacres of Jewish communities were common throughout Western Europe during this time. Jews were formally expelled from England in 1290 and in France in 1306. In 1298, estimates are that between 20,000 and 100,000 Jews were massacred across what is now Germany in what is called the Rhindsfeld massacres. But on the Iberian Peninsula, rather than expelling members of other religions and ethnicities, Spanish law and custom simply created a number of different classifications for each group, each having different social statuses. Mulwalid were native Iberians who had converted to Islam. Moriscos were Arabs who became Catholic. Mozarabs were Christians living in Arab-held lands, and Mujadar were Muslims living in Christian-held lands. Depending on where you lived or who was in charge, being a member of each of these groups, or being identified or being descended from one of these groups, would be an advantage or a disadvantage, both socially and legally. Jewish converts to Christianity were called conversos. Many were suspected of still being Jewish secretly, and as anti-Semitic views began to grow, many suspected anyone even of Jewish descent. As the Catholic Church grew in power and influence, a series of local laws around lineage emerged that became to be known as La Pensa de Sangre, or cleanliness of the blood statues. One legal record of a man wrote that he was attempting to break a betrothal, and said, quote, "Being that the aforementioned Aguilo has approved to be the descendants of Jews, and these being disgraced by said infamy, even if they had been engaged, said Molones should not marry her, because he is of clean blood." Slavery also continued in Spain. One of the legal restrictions against Jewish and Muslim communities in Catholic-controlled areas was that they were forbidden from owning slaves. But it's likely having a large slave community from these faiths helped maintain the size of these communities even in Catholic regions. Prior to 1434, the sub-Saharan African slaves who came to Spain came almost exclusively from the Mediterranean North African slave markets. This was because it was generally believed that it was impossible to sail past Cape Bajador in Africa to reach sub-Saharan Africa. But as the Byzantine Empire came under greater threat from the Ottomans, sailors became more willing to take greater risks to find alternative routes to the Far East. Modifications to new ships such as the Caravel allowed the Portuguese to figure out a way to how to navigate around Cape Bojador and eventually trade directly with the sub-Saharan Africa. Much like the camel before it, this new technology completely changed the regional trade routes. By 1441, Portuguese slave traders were tapping into the already existing slave trade in that region, and by 1444, they were able to fully supply a slave market in the port city of Lagos, Portugal. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V made explicit in a papal bull entitled Dum Diversa that the enslavement of non-Christians was not only acceptable, but encouraged in the ongoing Crusades. He authorized the King of Portugal to conquer, quote, Saracens and pagans. Saracens being a Greek word for the people of Middle Eastern descent, but that had become to be associated with Muslims. Those captured would be placed into, quote, perpetual servitude. The bull stated, quote, "We grant you by these present documents with our apostolic authority full and free permission to invade, search out, and capture and subjugate the Saracens and pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate and convert the use and profit of yourself and your successor, the King of Portugal, in perpetuity, the above-mentioned kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other properties, and possessions and such like goods." In 1455, Pope Nicholas V gave Portugal exclusive rights to expand the slave trade from West Africa, so long as attempts were made to convert the enslaved. This used a loophole in the Catholic law where if someone was enslaved before they became a Christian, they could remain enslaved. Slaves were given a form of baptism before being sent to Portugal, which technically made them Christians, but still allowed them to be kept as slaves. But this also meant that if a slave remained a Christian, their children would be born Christian, and the slavery would only last a single generation. Portugal was also able to occupy and cultivate a number of islands off the coast of West Africa, including Cape Verde and Madeira. The island of Madeira specifically became very profitable due to the climate allowing sugarcane to be grown, as Venice had prior had largely a sugar monopoly. After finding fishing villages along the coast of what is now modern Ghana, where a large amount of ivory and gold seemed to be available, in 1471, Portugal decided to build a military installation they called San Jorge de Mina, or St. George's of the Mines. Soon after, the area became known as the Gold Coast. In 1469, two members of very powerful kingdoms in Spain, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, married. This marriage bonded the two most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula aside from Portugal. But because they were second cousins, special papal dispensation had to be granted for the marriage to be legal. But the marriage was so politically important that when Pope Paul II refused to give dispensation, a letter was falsified and the marriage proceeded anyway. The King of Castile, Henry IV, was Isabella's brother. Isabella claimed to be next in line for the throne, but Henry did not recognize her claim, stating instead that Joanna of Castile, a child born while he was married to the Portuguese princess Joan of Portugal, was actually a rightful heir. Isabella and her supporters claimed the child was not his, spreading rumors that Henry was impotent. Other accounts say this is untrue and that Henry actually frequented prostitutes, but it's unclear if Joanna was actually his child. When Henry died, Joanna was only 13 years old, and her claim was contested by the 25-year-old Isabella and her husband. The 36-year-old King of Portugal, Afonso V, who was also Joanna's uncle, married her in order to support the claim to the throne of Castile. A war ensued, and although Portugal had naval superiority, they were unable to conquer by land. A treaty was signed in 1479 that gave Isabella control over Castile. That same year, Ferdinand's father, the King of Aragon, passed away, making him King of Aragon. Although each kingdom remains technically separate, the two of them being married brought together most of the Iberian Peninsula. Despite a prior pope refusing to approve their marriage, the current pope, Sixtus IV, was very interested in a proposal they were making to create a holy office to administer an inquisition in Spain. In 1478, the pope issued a papal bull for the kingdom of Castile entitled Exit Sincere Devotion Effexis, which translates to Sincere Devotion is Required. The papal bull gave the monarchs the authority to hold heresy trials and appoint inquisitors. They created the Holy Office for the Propagation of the Faith. On February 6, 1481, in Seville, the first trials were held. They were called Auto de Fe, which translated to Act of Faith. During this first trial, 6 people were burned alive in the public square for heresy. More of these trials began to follow, and fearing things might spiral out of control, the Pope issued a new papal bull in 1482 forbidding the Inquisition be spread. He wrote, quote, In Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, and Catalonia, the Inquisition has for some time been moved not by the zeal for the faith and the salvation of souls, but by lust for wealth, and that many true and faithful Christians, on the testimony of enemies, rivals, slaves, and other lower, even less proper persons, have without any legitimate proof been thrust into secular prisons, tortured and condemned as relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and property, and handed over to secular arms to be executed to the perils of souls, setting a pernicious example and causing disgust to many. Now King Ferdinand denied the legitimacy of the bull, writing back to the Pope, quote, Take care, therefore, not to let the matter go further, and to revoke any concessions and entrust us with the care of this question. Ferdinand made clear he was willing to simply continue the Inquisition completely separate from the church authority if the Pope did not support it. The Pope conceded and went on to appoint inquisitors. In 1483, all Jewish people were ordered expelled from the kingdoms. Religious courts would use evidence such as not using a chimney on Sunday, buying too many vegetables for Passover, or purchasing meat from a butcher who had converted as evidence of secret Judaism. Those who confessed, often under torture, were usually allowed to live if they agreed penance, but any relapse would result in execution. Actual death counts are widely disputed, with the lowest estimates coming in at around 20,000 people during Isabella's reign. Some estimates go as high as 300,000 being killed over the entire duration of the Inquisition, which wasn't formally ended until 1834. Portugal also engaged in similar behaviors. In one event in 1506 in Lisbon, an estimated 3,000 Jews were killed. Regardless of the total number of victims, what is clear is that around the same time Isabella and Ferdinand were agreeing to fund Christopher Columbus' expedition in 1492, they were also actively engaging in ethnic cleansing. Not based on skin color, as Spanish had long intermixed at this point, but based around religious and cultural differences. What is also clear is that slavery was widespread even before the Columbian Exchange, and although it was at the time becoming increasingly connected to sub-Saharan West Africa, it was based far more around differences of religion and cultures than any issues regarding skin color. Columbus himself would be particularly motivated to find a new route to India, given that the city he was from, Genoa, had gained much of its wealth through its connections to Constantinople and through Constantinople to the Far East through the Silk Road. But in 1453, just 2 years after Columbus was born, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. This effectively cut off Genoa as well as other Italian city-states from their Black Sea ports and the Silk Road. It's in fact quite likely that the Portuguese explorers' willingness to take risks to try to find routes around Africa came as a result of fear of losing access to the Silk Road. Columbus was also not the first person to make the suggestion to the King of Portugal to sail west. Astronomers and most learned people had known for some time that the world was round, and many in fact believed that it would be faster to actually go west rather than try to go around Africa. In 1474, an astronomer by the name of Toscanelli had actually come to the King of Portugal with maps proposing a similar plan to Columbus. Portugal was more interested in finding a way to reach India by way of the Horn of Africa, as this would support their already existing African trade. This is likely why they first turned down Christopher Columbus when he returned in 1484 making a proposal. In 1487, Bartholomew Diaz would actually reach the Horn of Africa. Portugal would in fact not reach India until 1498 thanks to an expedition by Vasco da Gama. They were the first European country to do so, 5 years after Columbus had already returned from the New World for the first time. But as most school children know, Columbus was able to achieve funding in 1492. Columbus saw the mission as a holy one, writing in the prologue to one of his journals, quote, "In this present year 1492, after your highness had made an end to the war with the Moors who ruled in Europe, and concluded the war in the very great city of Granada, where in the present year, on the 2nd day of the month of January, I saw the royal standard of your highness placed by force of arms on the towers of Alhambra, which is the citadel of said city. And I saw the Moorish king come forth to the gates of the city and kiss the royal hands of your highness, and of the prince my lord, and soon after in the same month, through the information I had given your highness concerning the lands of India, and of a prince who is called Grand Khan, which is to say our vernacular king of kings, how many times he and his predecessors had sent to Rome to seek doctors on our holy faith to instruct them therein, and that had never the Holy Father provided them, and thus so many people were lost through lapsing into idolatries and receiving doctrines of perdition." Put another way, Columbus and his supporters were not only open to the conversion of people of different skin colors and cultures, it was one of their stated goals. But of course, words do not always match actions. On October 12, 1492, Columbus made his first contact on a Bahamian island, which he named San Salvador. He wrote of the encounter, quote, "They traded with us and gave us everything they had, with good will. They took great delight in pleasing us. They are very gentle and without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. Your highness may believe that in all the world there can be no better people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and they have the sweetest talk in the world, and are gentle and always laughing." He went on to write, "Many of the men I have seen have scars on their bodies. When I made signs to them to find out how this happened, they indicated that people from other nearby islands come to San Salvador to capture them. They defend themselves as best they can. I believe that people from the mainland come here to take them as slaves. They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they very easily can be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. If it pleases our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highness when I depart, in order that they might learn our language." It's unclear how many native people Columbus took onto his ship to return to Spain on that first journey. Reports vary as if he started off with between 10 and 25 captives. Only 8 managed to survive the return. This was the start of what would become a consistent trend in every first contact, as the native people of North and South America lacked the long-developed immunities to diseases that had ravaged the rest of the world, such as smallpox, the plague, and even the flu. On Christmas Eve, Columbus's ships were sailing near what is now Haiti. One of his ships, the Santa Maria, ran aground and was damaged beyond repair. With few other options, Columbus had the crew use the timber to make a makeshift fortification, which he named La Navidad. 39 men were left behind, supplied with provisions, trade goods, and weapons. Columbus also met with local native chieftains to make sure that it was permissible for them to stay. When Columbus returned the following year, he wrote that, quote, he found it burned to the ground, nobody in the vicinity. But in a field nearby were, quote, bodies of 8 Christians. A local chieftain claimed that raiders from the other islands had come, which Columbus initially accepted, but the chieftain's brother later reported that the men of the fort had come not seeking just gold, but native women, and as a result of their abuses they were killed by the natives, and the fort was burned to the ground. When Columbus returned on his second voyage, he came with a far larger number of ships, and also brought livestock. Soon after, disease began to ravage the Taino people. When the colonists arrived, there were an estimated 125,000 Taino. Within 30 years, between 80% and 90% of the Taino population had died. Most likely the leading cause of death was disease, as those death rates are consistent with early exposure rates from disease in other parts of North America and South America even before violence broke out. As an example, in 1495, when Columbus kidnapped 500 Native Americans who he believed to be the strongest and healthiest in order to take back to Spain, likely to sell into slavery, 200 of them died during the voyage of illness itself, and reportedly more than half of the 300 survivors arrived showing signs of severe illness. This exposure to disease was a repeated trend throughout all interactions with Native people. Native societies would lose huge numbers of people to disease, leaving them completely unable to defend themselves from outside invaders who were immune to those same diseases. And as deadly as the disease was, it can be argued in many areas the Spanish conquistadors and Columbus may have killed even more people than disease. The same people that Columbus praised in his first letters were forced into forced labor camps, where they died of famine or suicide as a result of the horrible conditions. Columbus's own son wrote of the forced labor requirements, quote, "In the Sabao, where the gold mines were, every person of 14 years of age or upward was to pay a large hawksbill of gold dust. All others were to pay 25 pounds of cotton. Whenever an Indian delivered his tribute, he was to receive a brass or copper token, which he must wear around his neck as proof that he had made his payment. Any Indian found without such a token was to be punished. Those who failed to meet the quota could find their hands cut off as punishment." Following Columbus' return, Spain and Portugal agreed to a treaty that divided both the newly discovered land and any as of yet undiscovered land between Spain and Portugal at a point roughly between where Columbus had landed in the Caribbean and Portugal's islands around Cape Verde off the coast of Africa. In 1500, a Portuguese expedition set off from Cape Verde, sailing southwest past the equator to reach land. They spotted land on April 22, 1500, seeing a mountain they came to name Monte Pascal, or Easter Mountain, as it was Easter weekend. This mountain was located in what is now known as Brazil, and after some minor interactions with local groups, they built a large cross to assert Portugal's claim to the land. Not knowing if they were on a continent, they named it Ilha de Veracruz, or Island of the True Cross. One ship was sent back to Portugal to notify the Crown of the discovery, while the rest of the fleet went on to cross the ocean further south to India. In 1496, Henry VII of England commissioned an Italian by the name of Giovanni Caboto to locate a North Atlantic passage to Asia. You may recognize him by the English nativization of his name, John Cabot. His first attempt was unsuccessful. A letter written to the king explaining what happened by someone working with Caboto said, quote, "Since your lordship wants information relating to the first voyage, here is what happened. He went with one ship, his crew confused him, he was short of supplies and ran into bad weather and decided to turn back." In 1497, Caboto tried again, sailing from Bristol, England, on a ship named Matthew of Bristol, with a crew of between 18 and 20 men. This trip was reportedly more successful, although it's unclear specifically where Caboto landed. Most believe it was somewhere in Newfoundland. He and his crew reportedly only actually went on to land once during the journey, reportedly never going, quote, "beyond the shooting distance of a crossbow." They made no contact with any native people, but did find the remains of a fire along with some fishing nets and tools. They reportedly raised a flag claiming the land for England, while also recognizing the authority of the Catholic Church, as it wasn't until Henry VIII that part changed for England, and then they returned home. Of the three groups of explorers, only the Spanish encountered large civilizations that had already cultivated the land and established settlements. In what is now central Mexico, the Aztecs had established an empire anchored by three large city-states, each which received tribute from between 5 and 6 million people. But where native groups encountered Europeans, disease would follow, decimating the population and throwing existing systems into turmoil. And the Spanish conquistadors were mercenaries, not missionaries. Hernán Cortés' small army was able to capitalize on existing internal conflicts and the rivals, as the Aztecs themselves were often viewed as conquering outsiders to those under their dominion. Many city-states paying tribute to the Aztec people spoke different languages and came from entirely different cultures, only being conquered and forced to pay tribute in the last 100 years. The Spanish were able to capitalize on these divisions to sell themselves as, if not a true ally, at least a lesser evil. During negotiations with a group that had descended from the Mayan culture, a slave girl had been given to one of Cortez's men, likely for sexual slavery. However, the young woman demonstrated remarkable language skills. Cortez promised her, quote, "more than liberty" if she would act as his translator. What this promise entailed is unclear, but she was taken by Cortez and became the mother of Cortez's oldest son, a son who would become his eventual heir. Her language skills allowed him to communicate well enough to form alliances with groups interested in usurping Aztec power. When that was mixed with the mass deaths caused by disease that his own soldiers were largely immune to, as well as having access to horses which did not exist in America prior to the arrival of Europeans, Cortez was able to take control of the existing trade, tribute, and slave networks very rapidly. After taking functional control of the Aztec Empire, Spanish conquistadors were able to use this foundation, along with the conquest of the Caribbean, to expand and conquer other nearby areas, such as the lands controlled by the former Mayan Empire, before eventually conquering the Incan empires and expanding all across South America over the coming decades. Existing empires were unable to defend themselves effectively once they were in regular contact with Europeans, as diseases ravaged the vast majority of their populations. But each also had infrastructure Spain could simply usurp rather than having to create, allowing power transition rather than be created from nothing. In contrast, although Spain claimed large parts of North America, including the entire West Coast, they did little to occupy those areas, as they were disconnected from the Central and South American trade networks by large deserts. Therefore, the path of least resistance was to expand by usurping the wealth and trade infrastructure of the existing empires of the South, rather than trying to create or build anything new. But because of the mass deaths of the native people of the New World from the mix of disease and violence, rapid depopulation began to break down these existing networks. Convincing large numbers of Europeans to take the risk of going to the New World, let alone going there to do backbreaking labor in mines or on plantations, was next to impossible. And so the transatlantic slave trade began. The same conflicts with the Islamic areas that had been the incentive for finding alternative trade routes to India in the first place had also cut off access to the Crimean and Middle Eastern slave market since the fall of Constantinople. But the new sea routes to Africa had opened up direct access to the existing sub-Saharan African slave trade without needing to go through the Islamic world or breaking the laws forbidding the enslavement of Catholics. The same treaty that created the division of the New World between Spain and Portugal also made Portugal the intermediary for any African trade, including sub-Saharan African slaves. In 1493, Portugal had established a settlement on an uninhabited island off the coast of Africa they named São Tomé, and started building a sugar plantation on the island. In 1497, approximately 2,000 Jewish children between the ages of 2 and 10 were taken from their families and sent to São Tomé, ostensibly to receive Catholic education and conversion, but realistically to provide a source of labor. After only a year in the harsh conditions, which included dangerous crocodiles all throughout the sugar plantations, only about 600 of the children survived. Looking for other sources of labor, the Portuguese tapped into the already existing Congo River slave trade, first for the sugar plantations on the island, but eventually these trade connections grew to the point that São Tomé was the center of the early transatlantic slave trade. With this trade came another disease that likely had not existed in the New World prior to the Columbian Exchange, one that was also rare in Europe and that most Europeans had little immunity to: malaria. Although malaria existed in southern Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean going all the way back to ancient Greece, because it was carried by mosquitoes who largely can't survive cold winters or dry climates, it didn't spread widely. Scientists had found some anti-malarial microbes in South American mummies, indicating it either existed there at some point or those who came to the world did so after exposed to malaria long ago, but there were no references to it that could be found in any Mayan or Aztec medical groups that have been discovered to date, indicating that if it did exist, it was rare. The import of sub-Saharan African slaves with the disease to tropical mosquito-infested areas generated massive outbreaks, to which both natives and many Europeans were vulnerable. This made African slaves, who were generally more resistant to malaria, incredibly valuable. As discussed earlier, the Catholic Church required that these slaves be baptized, and therefore their children would be born Catholics, raised Catholics, and could not be enslaved, at least according to the existing laws. So the laws began to change. Even prior to the discovery of the New World, in Spain, town leaders had been instructed to create detailed genealogies which were used to determine if someone was new or old Christian, and only those who were deemed pure were eligible for office or to immigrate to the New World as opportunities for wealth emerged later. In the New World, it became even more complicated as nearly all of the Spanish who came to the New World were men, meaning nearly every child born in the New World was of some kind of mixed heritage. Various laws of the Indies began to develop over time, creating what came to be known as the casta system, casta meaning lineage. While there is much debate as to how enforced this system was generally and how much in gradation it was to, quote, purity matters, what seems to be agreed on is that the distinction around Christian versus non-Christian began to evolve as more European versus non-European, as those who could only show that they were long-standing Christians were permitted to immigrate. In the New World, those who were of Spanish and indigenous pairs were referred to as mestizos, while sub-Saharan Africans were Negroes, Spanish for black. Mestizos, making up so much of the population and generally being the children and direct descendants of the Spanish conquistadors, were considered to be Christians and not eligible for enslavement. But throughout the New World, laws which originally gave special privileges to Christians, including laws that forbade enslavement of Christians, began replacing the word Christian with terms referring to the purity of one's blood, similar to the laws used against Jewish people in the run-up to the Inquisition, and then eventually specifically referring to those who were black regardless of their religion. Thus it became legal to enslave Christians so long as they were also black, and conversely, it remained unlawful to enslave those who were not black. This was, for all intents and purposes, the creation of whiteness. Now, a slave kidnapped in Africa and sold to a Portuguese and Spanish slaver was no longer a one-time purchase of a person who was forced to provide labor, but potentially the purchase of an entire family of laborers for generations. African slaves in the New World had no real hope of returning home, as might be the case for an internal sub-Saharan slave trade, not across the ocean, and there was far less incentive for slave owners to allow slaves to purchase their freedom over time given the value of children versus anything individual slaves might earn. Between 1500 and 1580, approximately 74,000 Africans were sold into slavery and taken across the Atlantic. As settlements became more well established by both the Spanish and Portuguese, between 1580 and 1640, Around 714,000 Africans were taken from Africa and sold into slavery across the ocean. Indigenous people continue to be enslaved, but their susceptibility to disease and risk of them being able to either escape, either back to their homes or by blending in to the now highly genetically mixed Spanish and Portuguese settlements, made them far less valuable as slaves. Still, if you as a society are going to damn not just a single person, but all of their children and their children's children to enslavement with nearly no hope of escape, you're going to need to create a rationalization for doing so beyond simple greed and selfishness. As historian Eric Williams argued, quote, slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. So fundamental a change was all of this that prior to the mid-1500s, the word race in the English language had no connection to a group of people. Race in English came from the word Norse, ras, meaning rapid forward movement, and was only used to describe something like a foot race. It was only after the start of the transatlantic slave trade that the word race began being used to describe a group of people, and appears to be taken from the Spanish word la raza. La raza itself had expanded in meaning, as its origins seemed to be in the discussion of animal husbandry, such as the breeding of horses. But during the early stage of the Spanish Inquisition, it had been added as a meaning as a derogatory description for non-Christians, particularly Jews and Muslims. One of the first Spanish dictionaries ever written in 1611 stated raza meant, quote, a breed of thoroughbred horses, commonly stamped with an iron brand to identify them. But it had a second meaning as in, human lineages, raza applies to their bad side, as in the case of the raza of the Moor or the Jew. Put another way, words had to be created to describe this new idea of race outside of culture and ethnicity. Prior to this, there was the ability for someone who appeared different to still assimilate and become part of the majority group in power, as was the case in both the Roman and Egyptian empires, as newly conquered areas became part of the larger empire. But with linkages to things beyond your control or choices, being part of a group became permanent, unchangeable, and a trait passed on to children regardless of their actions. And it is no coincidence that the need to add this word to the English language came around the same time the English finally began establishing colonies in the Americas, when Spain showed vulnerability after the failure of the Armada to conquer England. It was around the time that the word white began to take new meanings, as prior to the 1600s, people from England didn't refer to themselves as white generally. There were some uses of it to describe complexions of wealthy women, but it first came into its current use as a contrast to East Asians during the early colonial contacts. And England's relatively late entry into colonialism meant they were also created different kinds of colonies than those who came before them. Their new colonies were often in areas that had largely been unsettled by Europeans, and the first contact with the purpose of colonization rather than exploration. Therefore, English colonies tended to have less intermarriage and cultural exchange with those who were there prior. When the Spanish and Portuguese arrived, they sent almost entirely men, meaning their children were largely interracial. In most areas, these interracial children, along with free blacks and indigenous, far outnumbered those who would claim more or less direct European lineage. And so despite creating the concepts, separation based on race in those colonies wasn't particularly practical. When the French took over Haiti, they created 4 subgroups, which were defined in law as Grand Blancs, or big whites, having the most power, followed by Petit Blancs, or little whites, and below them free coloreds with slaves at the very bottom. But again, those in power were also the minority. But as England began to establish colonies, their colonies brought family groups to settle areas, which reduced intermarriage and created more formal separation in both law and custom around those relatively new racial ideas. But as many of these early settlements were in places that were particularly vulnerable to diseases like malaria, a disease the English had very little exposure to and great vulnerability to, attempting to replicate English feudal traditions of peasant laboring on the land owned by their feudal lord was more or less impossible under these conditions. And other English labor sources, such as indentured servitude and prison labor, were also not sustainable, as between a third and half of those brought over died before their contract was completed. And so the English, like the Spanish and Portuguese before them, turned to the transatlantic slave trade and wrote the laws of the colonies accordingly. In 1661, the local parliament of British Barbados passed a series of slave codes, which were generally used as models for similar laws throughout all British colonies. These laws made clear that free blacks were still to have less rights than non-blacks, often to the point that there was no distinction between free and slave. For example, one code said, quote, if any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or any other form of violence, such Negro or slave shall for his first offense be severely whipped by the constable. For his second offense, that nature shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron. and after being brutish slaves, they deserve not for the baseness of their conditions to be tried by the legal trier of 12 men of their peers, as the subjects of England are. And it is further enacted and ordained that if any negro or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or member, which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be held liable to any fine therefor. The law also made it illegal for anyone of Jewish descent to own slaves or even employ black freedmen. Racial sexual separation was also clearly a high priority in law in the colonies. In 1662, Virginia passed a law making clear that children of slave mothers, even those who had white fathers, were born slaves. It stated, quote, "Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present General Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the conditions of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she also offending pay double for the fines imposed by the former act." This law is particularly notable, as in more or less every other instance of English law, the father was the source of legal status of the child. But this law allowed men not only to disavow their own children, but to condemn them and all of their children to perpetual slavery. In 1669, Virginia passed a law permitting the murder of a slave for disobedience, and made freeing a slave illegal unless the slave was also deported from the colony. It voted to banish any white men who would engage in interracial marriage. In 1671, for the first time, the Oxford Dictionary added the racial descriptor to the word white. It added as an additional use, quote, "a white man, a person of a race distinguished by a light complexion." But a distinction and a disadvantage for blacks wasn't enough to prevent some alliances. In 1676, a group of indentured servants allied with African slaves and freedmen in what came to be known as Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's group formed around a resentment at taxes and the Virginia governor not being willing to go after Native Americans in the area. Nathaniel Bacon wrote in his manifesto that he wanted to, quote, "ruin and expatriate Indians in general, but all manner of trade and commerce with them. Judge who can be innocent that strike at this tender eye of interest, since the right honorable the governor hath been displeased by his commission to warrant this trade, who dare oppose it, or opposing it can be innocent, through plantations deserted, the blood of our dear brethren spirit." The rebels were able to set fire to Jamestown before the insurrection was suppressed. Following Bacon's rebellion, laws and practices giving advantages and disadvantages based on skin color expanded. In 1680, the state of Virginia passed laws that forbid blacks and slaves from bearing arms or, quote, "congregating in large numbers." It was critical to create divisions between these groups, because as a slave ship captain wrote in his journal in 1694, quote, "I can't think there is any intrinsic value in one color more than another, nor than white is better than black, only we think it so because we are so." In 1507, Virginia law made clear that slaves could be murdered without consequence, stating, quote, "all servants imported and brought into the country, who were not Christians in their native country, shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened." This isn't to say there was no resistance or that these ideas weren't challenged. In the 1670s, many Christian mission Quakers argued slavery was immoral. Missionary George Keith argued, quote, "But what greater oppression can there be than inflicted upon our fellow creatures than is inflicted upon the poor Negroes? They being brought from their own country against their wills, some of them being stolen, others taken for payment of debt, owing by their parents, and others taken captive in war and sold to merchants, who bring them to American plantations and sell them for bond slaves, to them what will give them most, the husband from the wife, and the children from the parents. And many that buy them do exceedingly afflict them and oppress them, not only by communal hard labor, but by cruel whippings and other punishments, and by short allowance of food. Some planters in Barbados and Jamaica, 'tis said, keeping 100 of them, and some more and some less, and giving them hardly anything more than they raise on a little piece of ground appointed them, on which they work for themselves on the 7th day of the week, and in the afternoon on the 1st day to raise their own provisions, to wit corn and potatoes, and other roots, the remainder of their time being spent on their master's service, which doubtless is far worse usage than is practiced by the Turks and Moors upon their slaves." But those who oppose slavery were in the minority of those in power in the New World, given how dependent the plantations were on specifically sub-Saharan African slave labor, and this was particularly true in the Deep South. By 1708, in South Carolina, the majority of the total population had become enslaved Africans. To the south, the relatively new colony of Georgia was more or less all white and had not yet legalized slavery, but they would still return fugitive slaves if they were discovered. However, if slaves could make it all the way to Spanish Florida, the Spanish there would grant them freedom if they agreed to convert to Catholicism. The Spanish had even set up a fort called Fort Mose outside of St. Augustine, both to protect that area and to be a destination for fugitive slaves seeking to reach the Spanish Florida. On Sunday, September 9th, 1739, an enslaved man by the name of Jemmy had led a slave rebellion in South Carolina. Jemmy was born in Africa, likely in the Congo, as he spoke Portuguese and was reportedly already Catholic. Jemmy was literate and possibly a prisoner of war from the ongoing civil war that was occurring around the time in the Congo. Jemmy initially led 22 slaves in a rebellion near the Stono River outside of Charleston. Reportedly, the men marched down the roadway with a banner that read "Liberty" and shouted the same as they raided a store where they obtained weapons and ammunition. As they continued their march south, waving a flag, they burned at least 6 plantations and gathered more and more slaves until they reached around 81 people, killing between 20 and 30 whites along the way. When the lieutenant governor of South Carolina, William Bull, came upon the group, he rode off on horseback to raise the alarm and raise a militia to confront them. In the battle that followed, 23 whites and 47 of the enslaved men were killed, with the white militia winning the battle. South Carolina colonists hired Native American trackers from the Chickasaw and Catawba Native American nations to hunt down and capture any escaped slaves, and placed severed heads of the rebels on stakes along major roadways to serve as warnings for others who might consider revolt. A second-hand account of the event described it this way, quote, "I reckon it was hot, 'cause in less than 2 days 21 white men, women, and children and 44 Negroes was slain. My granddaddy says in the woods and the Stono, where the war start, there were more than 100 Negroes in line. When the militia come in sight of them at Combahee Swamp, the drinking, dancing Negroes scatter in the brush, and only 44 stand their ground. Commander Cato speak for the crowd. He say, 'We don't like slavery. We start to join the Spanish in Florida. We surrender, but we not whipped yet, and is not converted.' The other 43 say amen, and they was taken, unarmed, and hanged by the militia." Believing the cause of the uprising was the imported Africans, Charleston banned the importation of slaves for 10 years, allowing only trade in slaves more or less within the colonies. They passed additional laws to tighten controls over slaves, including restrictions on them learning how to write or earn money. Entire fields of pseudoscience began to emerge around race. Some argued those with dark skin still descended from Adam and Eve, but were suffering from ailments ranging from what one signer of the Declaration of Independence called Negroidism, that he believed was a non-contagious form of leprosy, to what Samuel Stanhope Smith asserted that it was more or less a full-body freckle. Others argued that races must have come from different origins, which would separate them from Adam and Eve and make them more or less not human. But despite using pseudoscientific language, they weren't based on any real research or scientific analysis. Even the minimal analysis done around things like the measuring of skulls was soon found to be, if not wholly wrong, at best based on cherry-picked evidence and examples. Still, these assertions about the superiority of Europeans, often the specific type of European that the author and the audience the author was writing to were themselves members of, became widely held beliefs, likely because they affirmed the rationalizations the audience wanted to believe in order to continue subjugating others. The same Enlightenment scholars who demanded empirical evidence and called for liberty and tolerance from monarchs declined to extend these arguments and criticisms to themselves around the ideas of race, as they would then also need to extend those rights to those that they themselves were oppressing and not just to the monarchs. As Samuel Johnson wrote, quote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps from liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" John Locke famously wrote, "All men are born equally free and independent, and have certain inherent natural rights, of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing or attaining happiness and safety." However, he also wrote of Native Americans that they, quote, "may be destroyed as a lion or a tiger, one of those wild savage beasts with whom men can have no society nor security." Philosophers like Voltaire at times condemned slavery, writing things like, quote, "Whites and Christians proceed to purchase Negroes cheaply in order to sell them dear in America." But Voltaire, having significant financial investments in the slave-trading French East Indian Company, would also write things like, quote, "It is a serious question among them whether the Africans are descended from monkeys or whether the monkeys come from them." And of Jews he said, "You deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny." Perhaps George Orwell described this cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy best in his story Animal Farm, where the animals, after driving off the farmer, wrote commandments, the most important of which being, quote, "All animals are equal." But when the pigs began to grow in power, they added to that commandment, quote, "But some animals are more equal than others." For Americans, there's perhaps no greater example of this complexity than Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "All men are created equal," but would also write of the slaves on his plantation, quote, they seem to require less sleep. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusement to sit up until midnight or later, though knowing he must be out at the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave or more adventuresome, but they may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents them seeing a danger till it is present. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites. They are more ardent after their females, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Jefferson went on to write, quote, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. Then Jefferson, after working with a black man who was arguably a genius by the name of Benjamin Banneker, he said, quote, Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given our black brethren talents equal to those of other colors of men, and that the appearance of want of them knowing merely to the degraded conditions of their existence both in Africa and America, I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commence for raising the conditions of both their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstances which cannot be neglected will admit. And that doesn't even get into the complexities around the Sally Hemings that matter. But acknowledging blacks might not be fundamentally inferior was a dangerous thing in a society built on the enslavement of blacks. It is far safer and much easier to simply go along with the beliefs of those who speak to your group, the group in power, simply saying that they are superior. Influential thinkers like Immanuel Kant went unchallenged when they said things like, quote, In the hot countries, the human being matures in all aspects earlier, but does not, however, reach the perfection of those in the temperate zones. Humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of whites. Kant also said that Jews were, quote, a nation of cheaters, and, quote, a group that has followed not the path of transcendental freedom, but that of enslavement to the material world. But audiences who viewed themselves as white welcome the praise generally without a second thought. It feels good to be told you're superior, and if you can convince yourself that you're part of a superior group of people, it becomes much easier to rationalize evil acts against those you decide are inferior, including war. As Victorian Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli said, quote, The difference of race is one of the reasons why I fear war may exist, because race implies difference, and difference implies superiority, and superiority leads to predominance. But I think W.E. Du Bois put it best when he wrote, quote, Wave on wave, each increasing virulence is dashing this new religion of whiteness on the shores of our time. Its first effects are funny, the strut of a Southerner, the arrogance of an Englishman amuck, the whoop of a hoodlum who vicariously leads your mob. History is awkward.